Hello, welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I'm your host, Lucchese, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. This year, we celebrate the Declaration of Independence. What exactly are we celebrating? Russell Kirk, who needs no introduction on this program, wrote voluminously on the meaning of the American founding. And the roots of American order, he argued persuasively that the American founding was grounded in the legacies of Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and only more recently in the experience of Philadelphia. A variety of his works argued for the importance of the British legacy, including America's British culture and the conservative constitution. A new book, On America, How to Understand the Legacy of 1776, brings together excerpts from Kirk's writings on the meaning of America. I am joined today by the editor of that volume, Michael Lucchese. Michael Lucchese is the founder and CEO of Pipe Creek Consulting, a communications firm based in Washington, D.C. He is also an associate editor of Law and Liberty and a contributing editor to Providence Magazine. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me on, Luke.
So we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we're celebrating the start of the American Revolution. But that term revolution, maybe we should put scare quotes around it, or at least an asterisk. What was Kirk's view of the American Revolution?
Yeah, so that one of the essays collected in On America is titled "A Revolution Prevented, Not Made," which is a phrase he took from Edmund Burke, and he argued that uh, at least in the sense of modern revolutions, the way that we think about revolutions today, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, that the American Revolution has no real similarities to those sort of totalitarian outbursts that we got at the end of the 18th through the 20th centuries. Instead, he thought of it as a revolution in an older tradition, much like the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that brought the Whigs to power in England. He thought it was a kind of return to an old moral order. And so I think a lot of Dr. Kirk's work on the founding, American culture more generally, is an attempt to recover that older sense of the American Revolution, a return to the old moral order and to the sort of fountainhead of civilization.
Yeah, so you talk about John Adams at length. Well, Kirk talks about John Adams a lot. Let's talk a little bit about John Adams, because I think he's the quintessential Kirkian founder.
Yeah, so Adams, of course, is the subject of the second chapter of The Conservative Mind. He's sort of the founder of American conservatism, as it were, for Dr. Kirk. On the one hand, you have Thomas Jefferson, who's sort of enamored by Jacobinism, the French Revolution, the sort of radical form that the Enlightenment takes in politics at the end of the 18th century. And on the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton, who is, of course, wary of the French Revolution, but maybe didn't necessarily always see the way that some of his centralizing schemes could actually tend to reduce the space for traditional liberty. And so Adams is really, for Kirk at least, a better guide to understanding the true meaning of the American Constitution than either of these figures. He was an advocate of political balance, and that makes him what Kirk calls a true federalist. He was both a federalist in the sense that he wanted to balance the state and federal governments, but also that he wanted to balance the three branches of government, perhaps a little bit more balanced than Hamilton or Jefferson may have wanted. And for this reason, I think that Kirk really sees Adams as the great American interpreter of the political implications of that Western moral order that's at the center of his conservatism.
Yeah, and so Adams supported federalism, but unlike people to his right and to his left, as it were, they who supported it kind of out of they thought was the best they could do. They couldn't get more centralized or they couldn't get more decentralized, so they were going to compromise. He thought it just made sense. This made sense for what
Exactly.
America is.
Yeah, and he also definitely thinks about things in terms of a sort of classical Republican tradition. He and his son John Quincy see America as a sort of classical republic in the modern world. And so rather than stressing the discontinuities of modernity the way some other thinkers might, unlike, say, Thomas Paine, who said we could start the world again, they really look to history as a guide. They see history as sort of the communication of the transcendent. And I think that's the case with almost all the conservative thinkers that Dr. Kirk outlines in The Conservative Mind and in On America. They sort of see the history of America as a path to understanding the transcendent things, the permanent things that sort of define the human condition.
And along those lines, let's talk a little bit. Well, actually, I have one more thing to say about Adams. He wrote one of the single most important tracks, I think. Well, he wrote a lot of important stuff. My favorite is the brain tree instructions. I don't think it's mentioned in Kirk's essay, but it's, I think, captures Kirk's view of the founding almost perfectly.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really great example of exactly this classical Republican tradition that you and I have been talking about, right? Adams, even at the time of the American Revolution, was by no means the most extreme of the people in the Continental Congress. He was certainly an advocate for independence. He had strong opinions, and he wasn't afraid to advance those opinions. But unlike, say, Samuel Adams, who was maybe a little bit more radical and a little bit more willing to embrace the radicalism of the American Revolution, but also unlike some of these Tories who become high Federalists eventually in American politics. Adams is sort of trying to really understand what it means to be an American in this Republican sense. He's not really doing what we might later call ideologizing, right? And that's, I think, what makes him so different from the later revolutionaries of the modern age.
And he was probably, it would be fair to say, the most prolific of all the founders. His writing is, the volumes run to over 100, I think, in his collected writings. I mean, it's extraordinary.
It's sort of funny when you revisit some of his correspondence with, say, Thomas Jefferson, right? Adams writes three letters to every one letter that Jefferson writes. He really was voluminous, and a lot of his work too is sort of difficult to understand because it's sort of written in this labyrinthian way. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dr. Kirk is so valuable. He's a great interpreter of John Adams, right? He reads him very closely. He reads him in his context, and I think he's able to sort of present the core of Adams's political thought in a way that can be really instructive for conservatives today.
And next thing we should talk about is you included in an excerpt, what did Americans inherit from the ancients?
Yeah, and so this comes from one of Dr. Kirk's last books, America's British Culture. Um, the main argument of that book, of course, is that America has a fundamentally British culture. We inherited our language, our folkways, our religion to some extent from England. But Kirk is also sensitive to the way that this classical Republican theme sort of comes up over and over again in American politics. America's the new Rome. It's trying to sort of heed some of the warnings of classical authors about the failures of ancient regimes. And so his argument in that piece is that America doesn't inherit our political forms from the ancients, right? We're not just sort of slavishly following Greek or Roman models because in a lot of ways those failed. There are some things that we learn from their experience. For example, Rome divides power in a way that Dr. Kirk thought and the American founders thought was very salutary. But the Greeks gave us philosophy, of course, and these things are all very important. But primarily, what we inherit from the ancients is that sort of it's not political so much as it is cultural. It's about tracing this thread of continuity through Western civilization. What did we inherit, not just from, say, Athens and Rome, but also Cicero and Socrates? Maybe guys who didn't win out, as it were, in their own time, but passed us down this cultural civilizational heritage that in some ways is a lot more important than political forms.
Right, and it's important to remember that the British judges were reading Roman law. Uh, they were reading Greek and Latin. Like this was just the intellectual milieu in which they were educated and thought and wrote for centuries, up into including the founders. Many of them were reading in Greek and Latin and reading the classics.
I think John Adams provides a really interesting example of this at the height of the imperial crisis in 1775, right as he's sort of turning his mind to the problems of independence. Should we declare independence? He writes a series of pamphlets and essays under the pseudonym Novanglis. Right, this is a classical way of putting New England. Right, and I think that sort of encapsulates what Dr. Kirk sees as the American heritage. Somewhere in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville remarks, I think this is in the first chapter on the point of departure. Tocqueville remarks that here on American shores, democracy emerged fully armed, such that antiquity never could have dreamed of. And so I think that's another important part of what Dr. Kirk is trying to teach us about America. Not only have we inherited from the past, and it's important to understand that past, but also we're taking that forward into new frontiers, right? And so I think conservatives, especially traditionalists like Dr. Kirk, sometimes get this reputation of being stuck in the past, of wanting to return to an ancient age. And I think, thinking about revolution as revolving back to an old moral order, that can kind of put us in mind of, oh, we have to go back, as it were. But that's I think that's not quite actually what Dr. Kirk is trying to communicate with his traditionalism. He very much was a modern man, a man living in a modern world, and cognizant of that, and not wanting to repeal the whole of modernity or something like that. The way that I think he would put it is he was seeking to redeem the times, right? And it's this ancient wisdom that can really redeem the times that we are in right now.
So, and we should probably, we've been talking about his traditionalism. But he included an excerpt. What are American traditions?
Yeah.
Talk about those.
Yeah, so I think he talks a lot about these folkways, the way that most Americans live. Dr. Kirk, I mean, sort of sees as being basically traditionalist, basically conservative, even if it's not necessarily conservatism as a reflective political philosophy or something like that. The way that we celebrate our holidays, the way that we remember our ancestors, the way that we worship in church, all of these things are things that bind Americans back to the past, while also enabling us to sort of live out the story, right? And that's really, I think, my big takeaway from editing this book and thinking about what did Dr. Kirk have to say about America as such, right? We in Roots of American Order, which might be his most famous and biggest book on explicitly American themes. I think what he's really trying to do is help us understand the people who went before us as they understood themselves, not just as a sort of antiquarian historicist, sort of looking back and everything is all about context or something like that, but really the question that's most important to Dr. Kirk throughout all of his writing is how should we live? And traditions, even something as seemingly silly as the holiday of Halloween or Fourth of July parades or something like this. Dr. Kirk loved to celebrate them because they're a way of sort of living out America's story. It's seeing ourselves in these traditions, in this culture that we live in, and I think that that's really what I hope people are doing in this semi-quincentennial year is going back to the American story and saying this is ours, this belongs to us, and we are connected to the founders of these traditions.
When he talks there about some of these traditions, so he talks about, we're a democracy, we talk about a republic, but it's not quite right to talk about that in terms of radicalism. These town meetings, for example, they're our tradition. This is a tradition dating back at least to 1620 that you have a town meeting and make decisions at that town meeting.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with modern totalitarian forms of political modernity, whether we're talking about radical liberalism or Jacobinism, communism, fascism, whatever sort of centralizing power, centralizing approach to political power you can name, I think one of the problems with it is it's trying to impose a one size fits all solution on everyone, right? And Dr. Kirk was a great patriot. He loved America. He dressed up for the Fourth of July. He chose to live in America, even though he had these ties to Scotland and the United Kingdom, and spent time in Europe. He loved America, but he also didn't want to transform the whole rest of the world into America. You can't just take a New England town meeting and do it halfway across the world, where people don't have this sort of cultural capital or tradition built up and expect things to go well, right? I think this is one of the great errors of the French Revolution. They think that they're imitating the American founders, at least at first, but they don't have the kind of tradition of self-government that the colonies had built up over their 200 years of existence prior to the framing of the Constitution. I think another way of maybe describing how Dr. Kirk thought about tradition is there are particular expressions of universal principles. So a principle like all men are created equal that we find in the Declaration of Independence, that is universally true. That's something that can really, and Dr. Kirk says, can be a sort of political guiding star. But at the same time, you need to understand that in a particular way. It has to be sort of incarnated in your institutions and traditions in a way that can really educate people to understand the truest meaning of those universals. Otherwise, they just sort of become God terms and devil terms, as Richard Weaver, one of Dr. Kirk's friends, may have put it. And that's not useful for building up a serious political constitution.
And there's other things he talks about there that are we sometimes think of them in radical terms. So freedom of choice, so that just the ability to, I get to choose which church I go to. Uh, but the thing is, it's a tradition in this country. You get to choose which church you go to. So it's not quite right to say, well, we have this radical idea. It's like, well, actually, the New England towns were founded with their own church, and people could choose which town they moved to. So we have this tradition of religious liberty that shows up. So it wasn't a radical thing.
Yeah, and I think that for Dr. Kirk, one of the most important things about American tradition is that it is so religious, right? You were just sort of listing it there as an example, but it is the best example in a lot of ways. The very first piece in the collection is a piece Dr. Kirk wrote during the Korean War, actually. And it's about the title is Thoughts on the Fourth of July. And he's sort of looking back on the American experience. Why are we locked in this struggle with communism? What makes America, the American regime, different? And his very first answer is, well, we're a religious nation, right? That doesn't mean that everyone is religious or that some centralizing power needs to enforce a certain doctrinal position on everyone or anything like that. But you can really only understand American history through the lens of religion. Figures like John Adams and Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, right? They might not have been orthodox or traditionally religious in the way that we might think of with a lot of rigor, but they definitely see America and the American story as being somehow guided by providence, right? And conservatism, a reflective conservatism, as Dr. Kirk would understand it, is about finding that thread, that providential thread in our history and sort of tracing it with a sense of gratitude. And so you can look at all these crises in American history, and ultimately, I think one of the things Dr. Kirk is pointing us to is, well, we have to understand America as being part of a transcendent moral order. We can't take our own claims about political equality or democracy or something like that and say, well, we've sort of arrived at this rationalistic system that is universally the best and can be imposed on anyone, anywhere, anytime. Rather, we have to say, all right, we've had a lot of problems in this country. Dr. Kirk, of course, named his original title for the conservative mind was The Conservatives' Rout, as in, the defeat of conservatism. So, if you look back at American history or Anglo-American history more broadly, right, there are a lot of defeats, but these sorts of conservative principles remain universally valid and true, even in those defeats. And it's America's religious tradition that enables us to sort of redeem the times in that sense.
Right. That's the first section of the book. You have the three sections here. The first one, we've been talking about American roots. So culture, traditions, what are they? Where do they come from? Just as another example, the brain tree instructions that John Adams wrote in the 1760s. Towns Braintree is a town in Massachusetts where he lived outside of Boston, and writing instructions was a tradition of these towns that had been around for generations, that they instruct their representative to Boston on what he's supposed to do. And that's what that was. That document was he was the one tasked, a young lawyer, to write up what the town thought about about all the acts being passed by Parliament. So that was they were following their traditions of how they handled things when they were unhappy.
Yeah. So the second section is about other statesmen. Well, the first section is in that is on John Adams, but the second section is on other statesmen who do something similar in their own time. So John Randolph of Roanoke, who was kind of an opponent of John Adams, interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln, and then Ronald Reagan is how we close out the section. And I think that what each of them have in common is they're doing exactly that kind of political activity, Luke, that you're describing there, right? The Lincoln chapter, it's actually never been fully published before. Bits and pieces of it have appeared elsewhere, but the full text is being published in this volume for the first time, which is very exciting. It's a speech that he gave to the Lincoln Club of Los Angeles. And he sort of goes through Cicero's list of virtues. And what does Cicero, this great classical political thinker, think we need in order to have good statesmanship? And he says Abraham Lincoln embodies each of these virtues. Prudence, humility, gravitas, dignity. These are all things that Lincoln embodies in a way that I think is the most profound example of it in American history. Lincoln sort of becomes for Kirk one of the other great interpreters of the American founding. He stands for order against the disorder of secession. He stands for moderation against political radicalism, and ultimately that's why he saves the Union.
Right. And you have a great essay in there. Will American Caesars rise?
Yeah, so Kirk, during his own life, was very dissatisfied with most of American politics. He was a great supporter of Barry Goldwater, who lost terribly in 1964. LBJ becomes president, and he despised LBJ. LBJ sort of embodies everything that Kirk hates about modern contemporary liberalism: centralizing the state, coarse values, maybe not the best at fighting the Cold War, right? And then after LBJ, you get Nixon, and Dr. Kirk actually knew Richard Nixon. Nixon had sort of come up. He wasn't really a member of the conservative movement as such, but he had this sort of relationship with the conservative movement. So we would sometimes bring conservatives into the White House to sort of talk to him about the issues. And in this chapter, Dr. Kirk counts coming and visiting President Nixon at the White House and recommending that he reads T.S. Eliot's Notes for the Definition of Culture, which is just a wild thing to tell a sitting U.S. president to do, right? He's dealing with all these foreign crises. Vietnam is still going on, domestic unrest, racial and otherwise. And Dr. Kirk says, well, you know what you really need to do? You need to read this modernist poet's reflections on what culture means. And I think that's exactly the kind of advice that Dr. Kirk would give us in our present circumstances. Too much politics, too much focus on political solutions, on competition over power. That's exactly how we get the problems of Caesarism that he was so cautious and so wanted to avoid. So I round out that section with a selection from Dr. Kirk on Ronald Reagan and the virtue of audacity. And he sees Reagan as really the kind of conservative statesman we needed during the Cold War. He had the ability to imagine not just creative political solutions, but also these political solutions in a certain cultural and traditional context. Right now in the conservative movement, Reagan sometimes gets attacked by folks on the new right, by folks who are sort of looking more leftward in reaction to the new right. But I think that the kind of political statesmanship that Reagan represented is something that we need to revive now. The virtue of audacity, as Dr. Kirk called it.
And he talks with one thing Kirk criticized politicians for was their lack of poetic imagination, which is why he recommends T.S. Eliot to a sitting United States president. Reagan had been criticized for being unsophisticated. But I think Kirk mentions in that essay, Reagan may have acquired the poetic imagination.
Yeah, and he cites his experience as an actor, actually. This is another thing that Reagan and Lincoln have in common. Lincoln was not a stage actor, but he was a great admirer of William Shakespeare. And he sort of Lincoln, I mean, reads his life through Shakespeare's plays. And I think Reagan does something similar in his own life. And I think that's exactly what Dr. Kirk admired about both of these guys, right? I think reading your life through the works of William Shakespeare or Chaucer or Homer or Dante, these great poets of the Western tradition, that's how you understand yourself as a human being, not just as somebody who's bound to a particular time and place. But it helps you to better understand that particular time and place. And Reagan is perhaps the greatest president in the 20th century at doing that thing, right? And perhaps he wasn't quoting Shakespeare the way that Lincoln does. Perhaps Lincoln achieved something even greater than anything Reagan achieved, but Reagan was able to achieve what he did, winning the Cold War, namely, and fighting the growth of the administrative state by appealing to that poetic imagination, by appealing back to the tradition that sustains America's roots.
We should say a few more things about the American Caesars. In other essays not included in this volume, towards the end of his life, uh, Kirk called, I think he talks about Caesar Bush and Caesar Clinton. He dies in the 1990s, but he did not like the presidents that came after Reagan. He did not refer to Reagan as Caesar Reagan.
No, no, no. To the best of my knowledge, he was always a great admirer of President Reagan up to the end of his life. I think with President Bush, who he initially supported, of course, and then later Clinton. Um, I think what Dr. Kirk was so offended by was the sheer decline from the greatness of Ronald Reagan. Reagan understood American conservatism. That was the tradition he came out of. He was influenced by figures like Whittaker Chambers, like Russell Kirk, like others that we could name, William F. Buckley. Whereas Bush and Clinton, especially Clinton, have no real regard for this kind of tradition, and they're just sort of political animals, at least in Dr. Kirk's estimation. And I think that's exactly what sort of inclines modern politics, by which I mean contemporary politics, really post Cold War politics, to the kind of not just centralization and political dysfunction, but also vulgarity that we've seen us mired in, right? And George H.W. Bush, the prim and proper WASP was maybe a step or two away from this, but I think what it indicates is that for Dr. Kirk, tradition is not an outward garment you can just sort of put on and you dress the right way and you talk the right way and you wear the right color tie and you're good to go. It's something you really have to embody. And in his estimation, George H.W. Bush didn't do that. Clinton certainly was never really trying to do that. And I think that had Dr. Kirk lived to see the sort of political mess of the 2010s and 2020s, I think he would perhaps be even more disgusted with the blue Caesar, red Caesar competition that we find ourselves caught in the middle of right now.
And your last section, American Letters, and you've got some great essays excerpted here. Let's talk about that. What was Kirk's view of? Well, we talked a little bit about his poetic imagination and what he thought about that, but talk more generally about Kirk's view of American letters.
Yeah, so if conservatism isn't necessarily always thriving politically in the Anglo-American tradition, Dr. Kirk always insisted that it thrived in a literary sense. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne is the figure that I start the section with. He's sort of the first great American author in Kirk's estimation. And it's because when America is born, such as it were, right, there's the sense that maybe we can regenerate the world. Maybe we can redeem everything as a sort of political unit, doing something very different from what folks are doing on the other side of the Atlantic. Out of this sort of sensibility, you see Jeffersonianism emerge. You see the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson sort of come up out of it. I think the abolitionist movement represents this to some extent. Um, and Hawthorne stands opposed to all of that. Hawthorne says, no, original sin is real, and we have to remember that it's real. It's something that is part of the human condition that we have not solved simply by going west and settling the frontier. It's something that continues to live on in every human heart. And so for Dr. Kirk, right, this is the fountainhead of great American literature, wrestling with the truth, the reality of sin. Whether we're talking about Hawthorne wrestling with the sins of the Puritan community in New England, or William Faulkner wrestling with the sins of the South and the legacy of slavery. This is really the substance of great literature. And so literature is a kind of moral teacher then. And what Dr. Kirk picks up on in American literature is this moral teaching, this wrestling with original sin. And I think, especially right now where you don't see a whole lot of that in American literature, I think it's an important thing to remember and recover, especially for young people. I remember when I read The Scarlet Letter in high school, I was not a huge fan at first. And then I came across The Conservative Mind and sort of was reintroduced to Nathaniel Hawthorne through Dr. Kirk. And it helped me really understand the greatness of that novel and of his other works. So I think I hope at least that the book will help people maybe revisit these American greats that we all sort of hear their names of, and they're part of the substance of American culture, but maybe not everyone is dove in to the deep end, as it were. But Dr. Kirk can really help us understand the inner meaning of the American literary tradition.
Right. And let's go through these. We have some other things to talk about, but that's the first essay, is Hawthorne. So leading off, we produce great literature here in America. We have Hawthorne, and he kind of sets the tone. What is it? It's about original sin. I think other American authors, great authors, have fallen into that category. Flannery O'Connor is a classic
Yeah,
example. And Kirk.
James Fenimore Cooper.
Yep.
James Fenimore Cooper, I think, is another example of this. And then uh, the next essay collected here is on Mark Twain. Actually, I'm very proud of this. This was something that Annette Kirk and Cecilia Kirk Nelson helped me discover in the archives at Macasta. It's a previously unpublished introduction to Huckleberry Finn. Um, and I love this because it also shows how much Dr. Kirk loved to have fun. That's something that's really important. I think because conservatism is so often defeated, there's the sense that it's somehow some sort of depressing ideology or ideology of depression. I think Dr. Kirk would reject that wholly, right? Uh, Conservatism is about having fun too. Buckley embodies this, Kirk embodies this, but also his approach to Dr. Kirk's approach to Mark Twain in this essay embodies this. Twain is interesting because he's not quite a conservative in the way that maybe Nathaniel Hawthorne or later on T.S. Eliot would be. He's sort of a nihilist, actually. But also, he's really fun to read, and he does communicate something important about the American soul. And so, what Dr. Kirk is trying to do in this interpretation of Huckleberry Finn is understand, all right, why do I laugh, and what's really good about this book? How can we, and he even says that it's a kind of children's literature. So, how can we revisit these texts from our youth and extract a kind of meaning from it? So, I also like this essay as a kind of educational endeavor. It teaches you how to read a book well from this conservative literary standpoint. It was just a real hidden gem that I came across, and I'm so glad to have brought it out in print for the first time ever.
Yeah, what I love is just his conclusion in that essay is, why should you read Huck Finn? Because it's fun. That's the primary reason. It's that's the thing is Kirk is known, well, perhaps not in these, well, I guess is known in these circles, for he wrote ghost stories, but he liked to tell ghost stories too, because he liked to scare people who came to his house. He enjoyed like the thrill, and he enjoyed getting them, riled up with his stories. And you have in here the fourth generation of Adams as well.
Yeah, Henry and Brooks Adams, who are sort of at the end of the great Adams family political dynasty. And these figures, this essay on these two great figures is also about wrestling with a kind of nihilistic temptation for conservatives. The Adams family was never, as I mentioned earlier, was never really traditionally religious. They didn't have an orthodoxy that they clung to the way that other great figures perhaps did. Um, and so for Dr. Kirk, their conservatism becomes a kind of over time it sort of degenerates into this conservatism without a sense of providence or without a sense of the providential ordering of human history. And so it's picking up these themes that you also see in this Mark Twain essay, I think. It can be hard to be a conservative and look at the decline of your regime, and all regimes eventually decline, including America. Uh, but you also have to look for what promises regeneration, what promises hope and renewal. And that's kind of hard to see in Henry and Brooks Adams. They're very depressing writers to read. And Henry Adams's great novel Democracy, I love that novel. It's a great novel. It's very funny. It's sort of Jane Austen set in late 19th century American politics. So it's really great and it's fun to read. But there's also this sort of nihilistic thread that's sort of running through it. Is the republic worth preserving? What allegiances do we really owe? And I think Dr. Kirk doesn't want us to just ignore those sorts of questions. We have to confront them head on. We have to say, all right, let's take stock of where we are right now. Let's take stock of the real decline that we face. But instead of despairing in the face of that decline, we have to search for hope. We have to see what we can do to actually keep the flame alive, as it were.
And there were this is Kirk talks, as you talked about at length. There's conservatism in the literary tradition in a way that's is off and on in the political tradition. So, poets T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost, for example, he has an essay on them as conservatives.
Yeah, so this comes from the very end of The Conservative Mind. The chapter it's from is called The Conservative's Promise. And I think, in some ways, the most hopeful of all the chapters in The Conservative Mind. Um, and he focuses at the very end on T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost as great conservatives. I'm hoping that this book helps us understand that they're great American conservatives too. Frost is generally recognized as a great American poet, not necessarily as a conservative, although I think Dr. Kirk makes a strong argument that he was a distinctly conservative figure. Uh, but Eliot is not necessarily considered an American. He was born in America. He came from a long line of Americans, grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, but he becomes an expatriate and eventually a British subject, actually. And so there's some debate about should T.S. Eliot be considered an American poet? Is he contributing to the American literary tradition? And I have two arguments for why he ought to be considered an American poet. First, he had such an influence on the literature of this country, both as somebody who was writing poetry, writing literary criticism, but also as somebody who was a real mentor to a lot of American poets, perhaps most prominently the Southern agrarians, the Nashville fugitives, who Dr. Kirk also admired, and the new critics. So that's one argument, but I have a more fun argument too. there's this great letter that Robert Frost writes to his daughter. He and Eliot didn't get along famously. They had very different opinions about poetic style and the direction that American poetry should take. And his daughter was giving a lecture at Harvard sometime, I believe, in the 1950s, but it may have been earlier than that. And she asked, "Well, Dad, should I include T.S. Eliot on my list of Americans?" And Frost says, even though he's an expatriate, even though he and I don't necessarily get along, we must claim all things for America. And I love that line. I think that line sort of encapsulates how Dr. Kirk thought about Western civilization and how Americans ought to approach being a part of this global history. And really, what Eliot and Frost have in common, whatever their differences were, was this hope in the transcendent. And I think this is the antidote to the nihilism of a Henry Adams or a Mark Twain or someone like that, right? Poetry, literature, history, these actually can direct us back to the things that give life meaning. In a great speech, Dr. Kirk once wrote that the object of life is love, love of the permanent things. And I think that's really what studying American history and American literature can point us to. It can point us to the permanent things that are worth loving, that are worth defending, that are worth, as it were, conserving.
And you close your postscript, I think it's from Rights and Duties, Kirk's book, Rights and Duties, the Constitution in the Antagonist World. So talk about that and talk about why you chose that as the
Yeah, so
spin
so
off.
this is an essay in Rights and Duties, which was also sometimes published as the Conservative Constitution, and it's a sort of Burkean interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. Edmund Burke is not always considered. He was a friend of the American Revolution, but he's usually considered a very Anglo-Irish political thinker. But Dr. Kirk saw him as a kind of American founder too. He may not have been at Philadelphia framing the Constitution. He was an assigner of the Declaration of Independence, but he was one of the great minds of the 18th century, and he exerted a real influence on the American colonies and then the young republic. And so the Constitution and the antagonist world. The antagonist world, of course, is a phrase that Edmund Burke uses sort of for what other thinkers may have described as the state of nature. And so he's the central question of that essay is, how does the Constitution help us understand order in the world, and how might looking to the Constitution help us sort of rediscover the sources of order. And I find this essay particularly poignant because it was written in the 1980s, right at the sort of tail end of the Cold War. So at that point in time, it wasn't entirely clear that the Soviet Union would collapse necessarily, but it was certainly clear that under Ronald Reagan, America was finally winning the Cold War. Détente was over, and you could see the end of this long conflict against 20th century totalitarianism. So the question is, how can America shape a global order in a way that is responsible but also proactive? And I think that really the Constitution gives us a kind of blueprint for that, not in the sense that uh, it's something that every country needs to adopt. I'm not sure that our presidential system would work very well in, say, the United Kingdom, but it is sort of pointing to the idea that liberty and law can be reconciled, or as Publius puts it in Federalist One, that men can have good government by reflection and choice, not just accident and force. So I love that essay because I think it encourages a certain disposition to citizenship. Not only do we have to understand what the founders thought, what they said, what they wrote, what they did, but we also have to think and read and speak and act like them. We have to act like the founders would have acted. And that essay, I think, really helps us think through what that means. So I thought it was a nice note to close on.
There's one other last thing we should talk about, and that's where Kirk lived. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So there's a very short piece that I collected here, just called Mecosta County, and it's on his hometown, Mecosta, Michigan. And Mecosta is a tiny little town just a few hundred people lived there. But for Kirk, it embodied everything that was right about America. It embodied the kind of traditional community that he was hoping to defend in print and as a teacher. He chose to live there instead of living in Chicago or New York or places like this. Because they were his people and he belonged to it. It was a kind of little republic, all its own. And Edmund Burke, in the Reflections, of course, observes that we have to love our little platoons in order to love the whole world. And so I love this essay because it's just an appreciation of the place that he's from. And I think that's one of these dispositions of citizenship that conservatives can cultivate and can help the republic cultivate, right? America isn't America without Mecosta County, Michigan, or without the South of William Faulkner, or without the West, right? Like all of these parts of America are America, and we have to love the constituent parts in order to love the whole. So this is another way in which ultimately loving the permanent things is what it truly means to be a conservative.
Right. And I mean, you can see his traditionalism coming through. I think as he lived in the house his great grandfather had built, I think, because you know why? Because his great grandfather built it. So that's where he lived. It was
That's exactly right.
yeah, I mean, he would visit New York City. He wrote for National Review, of course, but he didn't move there. And
No.
he was an oddball when he showed up. Some of the National Review editors commented on it, and it was purposeful. I'm not from New York. That's of course I don't
Yeah.
live there.
Yeah, and that's not to say he didn't love New York. Because it seems to me that in a real way he did love New York, and he loved modern America. He loved visiting these places, but he always came home. And I think that's something that everybody, all these great figures, Nathaniel Hawthorne, uh, Abraham Lincoln, John Adams, they also embodied that kind of love, because that love is the real root of patriotism. Searching for our patria, loving our patria, defending her. Right. This is what it means to be a conservative.
Right. Well, Michael, this has been fun. Where can people go to find out about the book and about your other work?
Yeah, so the book is published by Creating Culture, and you can find it on Amazon, wherever good books are sold. And you can learn more about the work that I'm doing, the writing that I'm doing at Providence Magazine, Law and Liberty, two publications I contribute to, and also pipecreekconsulting.com. That's the communications firm I run.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman at kirkcenter.org/donate. Go to kirkcenter.org/permanent-things to sign up for the Kirk Center website email list. And I'll see you next time on the Book Gallery.
Thanks so much, Luke.
Thank you.